Adam, and any of the rest of you who may be living in Brooklyn, I don't know how you're experiencing, but it's very heavy in my house. And so I had a little fresh water in my face there.
Yeah.
This last part, it's the weather is heavy. Ben, I want to say again, thank you very much for that. It was really a rich paper, and I was just trying to answer that one question I thought you had posed to me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you very much, and I would love to follow up with you. And
I think I'm going to be answering in a broader sense because I'm trying to approach this question of ethics and via the notion of ethos. So let me get started and try to hold to time. For my few words this afternoon, I want to take inspiration from what Agnes Denes would term a piece of visual philosophy. I refer to a sculpture by her commissioned by the Shed in New York City and presented there in the course of this past winter, just before the pandemic. I don't intend to make an argument. I seek merely to draw forth what Agnes Denes's Teardrop, a monument to being earthbound, might offer to us for reflection on our theme, leaving Earth. The sculpture, of which you'll see an image on your screens, is actually a model for a future construction that Denes envisioned back in 1984. So in other words, she made a sketch. This then was produced as a model for the Shed, but she was envisioning something that would be a kind of futural city. Here is, let's see, I'm sorry. Here's another picture of the Teardrop in the exhibition. There's a pyramid behind it. I'll be coming to that. And this is the sketch that she produced in 1984. She produced this in the context of what she called her pyramid series, a set of works that dates originally from 1967 to 69 and on which she continued to work until 2014. Let me show you a couple pieces from this series. She'll produce things, as you notice, that don't always immediately make you think of pyramids. This is the pyramid that you saw behind the Teardrop before. And she also does land sculpture in a similar mode. So it started in '67, and went through 2014. But the fact is that Denes has understood almost all of her work to involve pyramids. Here, and I want to quote, are the opening words of a short history of the pyramid series from the book published by the Shed for the exhibition. That book is entitled Absolutes and Intermediates. And I refer to it in my notes as AI. Pyramids weave in and out of my work from the very beginning in diverse forms, dealing with a great variety of issues important to humanity. Each form and concept represents an enigma, something to which we must respond. These forms are a visual philosophy that conveys ecological, social, and cultural issues in a multitude of shapes. Every pyramid and every form presents a purpose, poses a question, and seeks an answer for humanity. She then continues a couple paragraphs later. There are real pyramids, excuse me, there are real pyramids and exotic ones, imaginary and philosophical. They represent logical structures, architectural innovations, and society building. They represent the past and the possible future we will invent. Some pyramids are not exactly pyramid shaped, and their meaning spans all of human existence. So the pyramid, as you will have glimpsed, is a formal vehicle for the visualization and exploration of what Denes terms analytical propositions, and more generally for reflection of a fundamental nature bearing on the past and future of humanity. I stress the phrase formal vehicle because it recalls the Greek metaphorein, from which we get metaphor, even as it condenses succinctly the analytic work, this phrase formal vehicle, condenses succinctly the analytic work Denes devotes to logical systems and mathematical structures in her attention to what she calls the formation or beginnings of form. All of her pyramids are generated with mathematical formulae and represent moments in this process where she seizes metaphorical potential for the visualization of thought or some form of question. With respect to this creative genesis, she writes the following. On this edge, new patterns are found and isolated. A reality of changing illusions emerges in flawless, pure forms that remain perfect, their own essence, for a moment, instantly metamorphosing into new systems and processes whose origin and destiny are predetermined. Predetermined, that last word, refers, I presume, to the mathematical substructures with which Denes works, structures that allow her to speak of perfect pyramids and the kind of purity of form to which nature itself tends in some essential structures. But perfection is not something ahistorical in Denes's work, or not the whole story. The pure forms are formally perfect for a moment, but for the poet or philosopher, they present enigmas. And I want to underscore that word. And Denes's poetic work involves seizing these moments and grasping their poetic import for the past, the future, and the present. We'll see this work of poetic capture very distinctly in the Teardrop sculpture, which speaks, I think, to a very special configuration of past and present in its visualizing of a potential future for human dwelling on the margins of our planet. Let me give one last citation to convey something of her visionary and poetic work. Pyramids can be stone, etched glass, paint, plantings, and even silk. They can be invisible as thought processes, logic and mathematics, or trees when they form a forest. Conceptual, shaped like a nautilus when a future city. Motion when they seem to awaken. Birds when they fly. History when they probe the ancients. Now, given the range of Denes's involvement with the pyramidal form, it will be apparent that contextualizing the teardrop sculpture in her oeuvre cannot be a simple matter. But Denes does contrast this work with others that belong to the pyramid series to which I referred. She contrasts this work with these others in a way that is quite illustrative, and it will give us a rapid path into our core concerns. The teardrop, she tells us, belongs to a group that she refers to as restless pyramids. We just heard about a few of these in her reference to pyramids that fly like birds. In describing this group, she writes, again I quote, all the restless pyramids. One of the reasons I quote so much is I love her poetic way of writing, so I'm just letting it go. All the restless pyramids are related, and they are born when the pyramid awakens. Realizing they are organic forms, the pyramids lose their rigidity and stillness. They begin to stretch and sway as they break loose from the tyranny of being built, knitted into form. They proceed to unglue their units, the program and method that binds their cell structure. Once their elements are free, the restless pyramids become flexible to take on dynamic forms of their own choosing. At this point, they decide to fend for themselves and create their own destiny. They also begin to look out for the inhabitants, for whom they create environments. She goes on to describe several of these stirring, liberated forms, and then comes to the teardrop, which is described as a floating monument. The sculpture consists of a circular base and a teardrop-shaped top, which levitates above the center of the base, afloat on an elastic cushion of magnetic flux. That drop is actually floating in the air. The top is gently and mysteriously moved about by air currents held in place by superconductive elements. When lit, the teardrop resembles the flame of a candle. These benevolent forms, she continues, direct their own destiny depending on neither, I'm quoting, the city of fools nor the paradox for their principles of perfection. Like grand mandalas, they define our destinies. Now, in the case of the two works just cited, from which she distinguishes the restless pyramids, perfection is realized in and through a social organization composed of isolated individuals who are unaware that they are in fact caught in a form of transparent count and accountability. I quote, "They cannot escape the structure, yet seem to be fooled by the illusion of freedom. Representing alienation and togetherness and uniqueness and uniformity, they assume the journey of living paradox. The pyramid they form is a society of visual mathematics in which they are but patterns and processes, number components of a mathematical system who believe they are unique entities." She will go on to describe them in their illusory condition as endearing. And this is very characteristic of Denes's social observations, which almost always tend to the comic or the tragicomic. They can be biting, but there is always also care. I'm sure I don't need to go on to develop here or try to portray what is captured in the second work she mentions, The City of Fools, in which she says confident technocrats are, I quote, busy making the best ruins yet for future generations to ponder and be filled with awe. In brief, in the two contrasted pyramidal forms, the paradoxical and the restless, perfection means two very different things. In the people paradox, one of the ones that shows a dysfunctional social organization, a society embraces an illusory freedom in highly organized forms that enmesh it in destructive contradictions that are worked out in repetitive usage through generations. This society, I would say, is eminently recognizable for us. In the futural time of the restless pyramids, on the contrary, an organic intelligence, another kind of pure technology forms that is self-defining and, fortunately, she says, benevolent, providing structure, I quote, for a different world in which the inhabitants will live in space, hovering above the earth, or else live on earth in self-contained environments. They have, she writes, another quote, a look of freshness and vulnerability. They are the future, and the future is always vulnerable and unused. In one of these restless formations, then, the monument for being earthbound, in that formation, the tear comes about. What is this tear? Is it a tear of sorrow or is it a tear of joy? And who sheds it? If time allowed, I would venture here on a very long course of explication because I believe that there is no simple answer to these questions. What Agnes Denes gives form to with the teardrop sculpture is an enigma that resists hermeneutic or critical reduction. With all its mathematics and technical brilliance and conception and construction, it remains a poetic proposition. It is art that realizes its essence as poetry, as Heidegger would have said, all the while standing as a wondrous technical achievement. Time won't, in fact, allow me to develop this, but let me at least try to sketch the lineaments of the work's captivating presence, which offers itself in an astonishing poise of contradictory or oppositional vectors. I referred earlier to the moments of perfection captured by Denes. What I would like to attempt here is a very brief description of the fundamental traits of this perduring moment given to us by a pyramid with the shape of a teardrop or a burning candle. We took perduring, by the way, from Francis Bacon, who wanted to create images that were like pyramids, and for those of you who are interested in Francis Bacon. First, I turn to what is most prominently conveyed in the sculpture, which is in the order of affect, or what we might term more precisely Stimmung, for the fact, attunement, let me translate that, for the fact that the affect is communicated in both form and resonance. In fact, this vulnerable form may be observed to tremble in a rhythmic manner as air currents traverse the magnetic field that holds the tear in place, suspended over its base. The affect is apparently sorrow or regret, some grief relating to the separation from Earth suffered by inhabitants whose being remains earthbound nonetheless. However ideal the dwelling, however benevolent it might be for those it shelters and sustains, it remains at a distance from the earth to which those inhabitants are essentially bound. Again, it is a monument to being earthbound. Now, earthbound could simply refer to the notion that the city that hovers above the earth remains dependent upon it for sustenance. But sustenance here appears to be something fundamental. There is a tear. Earth figures here as something more like the proper ground of human dwelling. The tear thus seems to express or reflect something like an ethos in the sense that the very meaning of human dwelling is defined by our relation to the earth. The Stimmung, or the Grundstimmung, the fundamental tonality, in this respect would appear to be mourning, or the suffering of a separation that cannot be overcome, or perhaps should not be overcome. This is once again a monument, and Denes even refers to its form as that of a flame. From a design perspective, it is difficult not to see a reference to an eternal flame. And you will remember images of this, starting perhaps if you are of my generation, with the one at Arlington Cemetery constructed at the time of John F. Kennedy's death. Of course, this form may be commemorating a past relation, something now irretrievably lost. To put this somewhat grimly, and keeping in mind that this is a self-forming organic structure that is shaping the very destiny of those it shelters, we may imagine that this is a tear that would one day, perhaps quite soon, be shed by an AI on behalf of a lost humanity, now wholly overcome in an evolutionary process. But this would indeed be a benevolent intelligence, capable of commemorating its own prehistory and recalling its endearing creators. I dare say that our hope for such a thing is probably vain. But I find it difficult to read this monument as simply commemorative of loss. For the tear, again, could easily be understood as a tear of joy. This joy could even be understood as ecstatic, produced in that exposure that Denes terms vulnerability. The stillness of it, though, suggests, well, the relative stillness, I've talked about it term, the stillness suggests something else, something more gentle. It thus recalls for me the tear of separation or departure that can be prompted by some Asian art. I'm thinking of some Japanese things that I've seen, where a poignant natural beauty is presented in a striking fragility that indicates its passing presence, reminding us thereby of our own finitude. My wife once remarked such an arrest, a feeling of arrest before a photo, which was related to cuisine, in fact. I asked her what was happening. And if my memory serves me well here, she remarked, "I'm pained that I have to leave this earth." That statement expresses relation in a sense of its temporal essence. Sorrow mingles there with joy in an awareness of our finite mortal condition and the exquisite beauty this makes possible. Perhaps astronauts have well documented such a feeling. I don't know the archive well enough. Ellie seems to suggest that in his video. But returning to the teardrop, let us, from this basis, try to imagine a dwelling. And again, the teardrop sculpture is a plan for what would be a city in which people would live near the earth, but separated from it. Let us, from this basis, try to imagine a dwelling that would monumentalize in its form what I have described as an ethos. Imagine a dwelling that would recall the origin in this way, constantly remembering the separation that makes us human. Architecture, in other words, become poetry. Human beings have arguably been on a road of separation from the earth since the beginning. Here I'm in accord with Ben, and I take my inspiration from the work of Leroy-Gourand. Humans have been on a road of separation from the earth since the beginning. It began with the first tools by which humans took a distance from themselves or became themselves. Technique, as Heidegger understood it, then represents, and from a long history, represents dangerous, potentially final step. But in danger, he said, there lies what saves. Does Denes perhaps grasp the saving dimension, namely a poetic, commemorative relation to the earth? Here I'm trying to read the end of the question concerning technology about art. There are two sets of verses from the poet Friedrich Hölderlin that are guiding me at this moment. Hölderlin was writing at between the 18th and 19th centuries in the context of the advent of German idealism. The first of these sets of verses is the one that Heidegger used to close the origin of the work of art. It comes from the poem The Journey, and it reads as follows, simply: reluctantly, that which dwells near its origin abandons the site. Reluctantly, that which dwells near the origin abandons its site, the site. In the years prior to the composition of his essay on art, Heidegger very brilliantly described the form of this reluctant turn in Hölderlin's poetry, taking his departure from Hölderlin's river hymns, which date from the period of 1800. The Easter, this is one of the river hymns, is of particular interest for us here, and for the way in which Hölderlin, and what he understands to be a properly poetic vision, sees the river as flowing backwards, or hesitating, somehow suspending its flow. That turning, which in another great river hymn, the Rhine, is given a topological form, a quite complex topological form. That turning defines the relation of separation that, when brought to language, as language, renders possible something like the saying of the earthbound ethos to which I have pointed. You will perhaps all be familiar with the famous verse from a late poem, full of merits, yet poetically man dwells. The river hymns are defining literally the structure of that dwelling as in poetic saying. Denis's levitating structure captures some of this, I believe, this collecting remembrance. The tear is itself bound eternally for earth, falling, But it also levitates in the conception of dwelling Denes envisions in her thinking visualization. A conception, which I understand actively as the capture of a beginning, not an abstracting concept. A conception where sorrow mingles with joy. I spoke then of a second set of verses from Hulinin, and I'm thinking in this case of an epigram that Hulinin drafted shortly before he undertook his translations of Sophocles, which is in fact around the time of the major river hymns. The translations came just afterwards. The epigram bears the simple title Sophocles, of course I'm in translation, and runs as follows. I quote, "Many have tried in vain to say with joy the most joyful. Here finally it speaks to me, here in mourning." So I repeat, many have tried in vain to say with joy the most joyful. Here finally it speaks to me, here in mourning. Now I can't go into Hulinin's meditation on the tragic at this point, but I will note that Hulinin saw in the course of tragic action a necessary turning back of humans toward the earth. That's what he thinks happens in tragedy, the bringing of humans back to their dwelling on earth. He speaks explicitly, if somewhat enigmatically in these terms, understanding the catharsis achieved by tragedy to involve a necessary recovery of human finitude, a being in time that would not shed the weight of being earthbound, but rather assume it. This assumption of an earthbound finitude was opposed by Hulinin to the speculative excesses he saw in the absolute idealism pursued by his past schoolmates, Schelling and Hegel. We see a comparable enthusiasm today, I fear, in some of the hubristic excesses driving contemporary technology and the raptures envisioned in various singularities and wirings, or the escape promised by space travel. I'm being far too rapid, I know. I love rocket travel too, and I'm of that generation, again, to which I referred earlier, but I shouldn't neglect this dimension of my attraction to Denis's future tier. I proposed at the outset a brief summary of the fundamental oppositional traits producing the strangely captivating poise of this work. I've touched upon a commingling of normally opposing affects, sorrow and joy, and I've touched briefly on the beautiful juxtaposition in this sculpture of rising and falling, striking traits after all for what is termed a pyramid. I've tried to evoke a departure that in its very separation is a return, and I've tried to point to the inherent undecidability that is proper to the enigmatic presence of this envisioned form that pauses and turns back as it takes flight. I'll dwell over one last dimension of the tensions that are drawn forth by the magnetic force deployed in the sculpture by turning to Denis's reference to a candle. Again, when lit, she writes, the teardrop resembles the flame of a candle. Again, a very powerful opposition emerges in the evocation of an eternity, and then a form that gives us an expression of human fragility, the tear, in a moment of separation, be this expression one of sorrow, joy, or a composition of both. This temporal opposition is, of course, already present in the very notion of a monumentalized tear. Now, admittedly, there is something potentially kitschy in the reference to an eternal flame, but this candle can give us something quite different. It evokes for me, for example, because there is a tear of joy shed at the gift of knowing and separation, the fact of being earthbound, it evokes for me the sabbatical experience of time. The Shabbat, of course, commemorates the gift of earthbound existence. We might even think here of Paul Celan's reference to this experience in his Conversation in the Mountains, where a candle gives time to one suffering isolation in what appears to be a concentration camp. I'm drawing on an extreme example, but time is short, and we are talking about the beginnings and ends of humanity. Let me read the relevant passage. It occurs in a fragmented exchange involving a Jew and another that occurs during a walk on a mountainside where it is said no Jew properly belongs. But the memory that is brought in this movement brings relation. And I quote then, I don't see that. I somehow did not get this quotation on my slide program. Let me read it then. I think you can follow it. Well, actually, it's not easy to follow, and it wouldn't be easy to read simply because it's somewhat broken and repetitive, but I think you will catch the core point. I lay on the stones back then. This is the Jew speaking. to the other. I lay on the stones back then, you know, on the stone tiles, and next to me the others who were like me, the others who were different and yet like me, my cousins. They lay there sleeping and not sleeping, dreaming and not dreaming. And they did not love me and I did not love them because I was one, and who wants to love one when there are many, even more than those lying near me, and who wants to be able to love all? And I don't hide it from you. I did not love them who could not love me. I loved the candle, which burned in the left corner. I loved it because it burned down. Not because it burned down, because it was his candle, the candle he had lit, our mother's father, because on that evening there had begun a day, a particular day, the seventh to be followed by the first, the seventh and not the last cousin. I did not love it. I loved its burning down. And you know, I haven't loved anything since. No, nothing, or maybe whatever burned down like that candle on that day, the seventh, not the last. Not the last day, no, because here I am, here on this road, which they say is beautiful. Here I am. That's the end of the quotation, and I just want to punctuate that this is the first time he's really able to say I am, or here I am, and speak to beauty. What the candle gives in its burning then is a love of time that allows for the possibility of relation to place, other, and to self. We are perhaps a long way here from Denes and her trembling pyramid. But again, imagine an architecture that could monumentalize in its enigmatic presence something of the relation to time evoked by Celan. A dwelling, in other words, that in its very form could commemorate a kind of originary gift, which is nothing other than the possibility of dwelling in an earthbound temporal condition. There are no tears in the perfect pyramid that is fashioned for us in much of contemporary architecture. And I see little hope for some salvific flight in the promises of AI, driven as it is by the urgings of capital. AI, as conceived today, will finally give us no more than the perfect pyramid. And I doubt it will ever shed a tear as it wraps its isolated inhabitants in ever more powerful illusions. Some very different mobilization of imagination is required, one that is capable of addressing the question of a human ethos. Perhaps Denes is offering us paths in her speculative play with mathematical forms, in her exploration of absolutes and intermediates. She sees futures in the unfolding of those forms, even in their self-unfolding, and is prepared to embrace them. Perhaps she is even preparing them. At the same time, it would appear that her tragic comic humor is meant to help us navigate the suspended state between. And given her impressive ecological projects and land art, including pyramids built with trees in the famous wheat field next to the Twin Towers, one would have to assume that this place between is on Earth, at least for any foreseeable future that is for humanity. Thank you.
Very much, Chris. We have time for a response from Benjamin or Shin.
Shin, you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? You pick.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the show also, and I do have the book just right there.
Oh.
I can bring it over.
I'm all the more interested in your reaction.
It's very heavy.
Yes.
It was my quarantine purchase also. Yeah, you guys just really have a snip of my life at this point. I found this really interesting. Even when I was in the gallery space, maybe for people who don't know, that it's not just her pyramids, like Agnes, she also have extensive drawing, hand drawing that is mathematically very precise. And in fact, you know, there's different projection of the earth into a square, into a hot dog. It was fascinating to observe. And then like later on, you also talk about like how that, especially even in your last sentence, you talk about this perfect shape and similarly geometry is generated through mass, or let's say technologies in general. However, recently I've been thinking a lot more around that. I'm no AI expert, but I've been working on a project that has a lot to do with let's call it embedded system, as the artificial intelligence trying to learn any concept, it chop up the information and then re-synthesize, or how to say, like take the hundreds more dimensions from the information and repeatedly generating another space, as the interpretive space of the information that it was trying to understand. And the shape it generates it is often high dimensional and sometimes extremely folding and not conceivable for humans. And there's ways you can, you know, through algorithms, you can unstretch it. Like the whole process of doing that project is very much connected for me in a way that thinking about Agnes' work and how our relationship with space and information or allocations and their refolding and unfolding again. And at the same time, like recently, the newest shape we've been able to generate is very different compared to what I normally understand as a computer system. So I don't know if it's viewable. It's kind of like this. This is a data that is later than stretched by a Tisney algorithm. Like basically it's high dimensional shape that is re-stretched out into a 2-dimension in order for human to understand. And that's not perfect. That's not what, at least for me, I understand as a technological shape. And I found that quite interesting. And I feel like it is almost like the next moment for me to at least encounter that similarly more organic and honestly bizarrely human looking of the technological space, that looking at that shape, I couldn't think of the system and the space it created as purely technological anymore. It is very much, it looks like my own brain. It looks like a dream map in many ways. And from the visual perspective, I think that was a challenging moment for me and very evocative at the same time to observe. And so I'm curious about how you think about it, and as AI and more complicated embedded spaces are prominent in our life nowadays. Or yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation with you about Agnes Denes, because this, I was very moved, but it's only the last few days that I really tried to do this, and so I'm very much in process and thinking about this. My question would be, when you had that experience of looking at this and seeing something more than the technical, what was the affect? And
very lively. It's there is certain aspect of the movement and shapes once you see the organism that it become, once the complicity reached to a certain point, it beyond our conception, it become alive per se, right? I think that's how we are alive at the same time. Yeah.
So it was a kind of recognition at that moment.
It's quite evocative. It's a little bit scary, and because I don't know if like as working with that system for my new project, whether I could understand it well enough. But at the same time, I feel like in the weirdest way, and birthing, like you create something that you don't really understand. And lots of my friends actually are having babies. I'm at that age, like they were telling me how they were observing a kid who would like move their hands, but well, Ben, you probably know better because I don't actually have a kid yet. But like when they move their hands, you would assume they're trying to grab things, but you later realize they're just reflex at the very early stage of the kids, maybe the first months or weeks, that they're just reacting towards muscle random stimulations, and then there through that process you see more and more clearly there's formation of intention as the kids develop. It felt a little bit like that as I was slowly growing the system in my computer. I don't know if it's weird.
So it reminds me of Holly Herndon's AI, which she presented last year, the EGS in Malta, which they called, what is it called? It's they have a name. They call it a child. They limited the information to it so that its development would mirror that of a child development. Anyway, I just want to say one thing in relation to, I think what I love about Denes is that she is not afraid at all of technology. She's math and technology, and is exploring it in just absolutely wonderful ways. And that's why I was attracted to this, because it's hovering on that very complicated border, between art and technology, and without any compromise in a certain sense, in both ways. One of the things, as I was writing this, I came to a very, as I was rereading it, I said, this is very sentimental, what I'm doing. But I decided I'm going to go with it. I'm going to let this happen. And I came to what I formulated finally, which is that it's perhaps our relation to time that becomes the condition of something like an earthbound condition. So what's at stake is time. But at the same, and this touches one Eli is developing in his presentation, but at the same time, there is an extremely powerful question there that sort of opens, and what is Earth in this context? And this is, I think, an immense question. Heidegger has his answers, and there are others, but I think that we are a long way from, at least from my knowledge, a long way from being able to answer that question. What is Denes trying to attend to in this notion of earthbound? But it's very interesting that a lot of her work is ecologically oriented, and the wheat field by the Twin Towers, or the pyramids of trees, and so on and so forth. So anyway, just following up on what you're saying, as opposed to any kind of answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and I also look forward to following up a little bit more in this with you as well. I suppose my remarks have a bit more to do with, and this again probably just has to do with the sort of the position by which I'm coming to these things in looking at this work in relationship to architecture more generally, and the work that in a way I know this is not presented as architecture. And something that has the certain capacities for dwelling in the same way in which architecture is meant to. However, in the question of the relationship of the Platonic form and the meditation on the metaphysics and significance of the metaphysics in relationship to the Platonic form that exists here, there is, as I'm sure you're well aware, a long-standing discourse within architectural thought about the propriety of the Platonic form and its appropriateness as a figure of order and figure of perfection that allows for some kind of a greater direct, not representation, but a direct instantiation of some other more metaphysical principles. We're a little bit on the chat here. There was some discussion around Boulet's dome from the 1700s, obviously unbuilt, but in this case, it's a grand sphere, not a pyramid, but a sphere that was meant to represent a kind of cosmological perfection and a certain kind of relationship of knowledge to earth and knowledge to ground and so forth. And so I wonder if there was anything you wanted to offer in terms of commentary, in addition to sort of seeing this work and this body of work as a kind of singular set of gestures, rather, if the way in which you want to situate it, more particularly in terms of the history of the mobilization of Platonic form within, within landscape scale and architectural and object scale design. The second question, which of course you answer them whatever order you like, had to do with the way in which you would ask us to make sense of the relationship between the form and the math, where you talk about, at some moments it sounds as though the inclination is that in a way the form is the thing that is causing the math, that there is pyramids which are a metaphysical, sort of a metaphysical construct that is instantiated through the sort of the mathematical operations. On the other side, you make clear that it's through the mathematical and algorithmic mechanisms of articulation and inscription and indeed calculation that these real forms emerge, both in the planning and in their continuing growth once their way as well. And is there a way in which we want to more specify that relationship between the form and the math that you think would be relevant here? And is there a way in which is the math that is at work here the same math that is at work in the figure of AI that you present us at the end, or are those two different kinds of maths in this way? So anyway, those are my two sort of questions and responses. There was another question about pyramids and tombs is another way of leaving Earth, but I'll leave that to our follow-up discussion.
Yeah. Let me go to the one about form and math. She's generating the pyramidal forms in what she calls the pyramid series from mathematical running mathematical formulae, and it's one from Pascal. She calls this Pascal's probability. Actually, I can give you the title. I'll do that very quickly. I think it's worth citing. I have my book too, Shin. This is, well, she has one called Pascal's Triangle, but then the one that is actually the basis for her critique of society that she referred to is, hang on one second, it's called Pascal's Perfect Probability Pyramid and the People Paradox. And this, she's using basically a mathematical formula calculating probability, and then casting it in a topography really, and creating layers with it. Elsewhere, she's working with Fibonacci sequences, or at least I know she's very aware of that, and connections are made with the kinds of mathematics she's using. But anyway, the point is, yes, the math is, well, it's beyond my means to tell you whether this is, how this relates to AI, but the forms are being generated mathematically. And what is of interest, what I was trying to get at in my paper or I was trying to think about, just reflect upon, is the way in which she generates these forms, but they present themselves in a kind of enigmatic presence for her that provokes a poetic response on her part. In other words, I was trying to say, she sort of seizes these forms in an imaginative way, in an extraordinary imaginative way. She seizes them, and that's why I was speaking of conception, a conception that I'm playing with the idea of the concept, begriff, that she grasps them in some form of meaning, in effect, but in a way that is extraordinarily conceptive. It's grasping what she calls a beginning in form, but at the same time, it's a very novel way of thinking. So what I'm interested in here in particular is the way in which the mathematical generation of form is then literally seized imaginatively by her. And math and form, in that sense, are not quite sufficient to this poetic proposition. That there has to be, in some sense, this conception that I'm describing. And in that conception, she is taking up the question of ethos. And the teardrop sculpture specifically. And there, I think I said it in my paper, but Heidegger in the Letter on Humanism defines ethos as dwelling. And so the dwelling is, you know, as I was developing with Hilden, involves a relation to the earth. So in the case of the teardrop sculpture, she is conceiving a certain form of dwelling or a relation to dwelling, and that's where the tear forms. Now, I haven't really thought of this in terms as a Platonic construction, because she's inventing essences as we're going in this creative process. She certainly goes back into history and interprets the way in which pyramids have represented ambitions and goals for humanity and structures for humanity. So that's why she talks about these are vehicles for exploring history. And in that respect, perhaps it fits very much in relation to the history of the thinking and architecture that you're describing. But at the same time, for her, there's an extraordinarily, there's a way of thinking the present in relation to the future also at work. And this is what I was trying to get at in this creative work. And there I'm trying to get at, you know, how we can think about a relation to technique or technicity that recovers something of that poetic relation that Heidegger is talking about at the end of the essay, A Question Concerning Technology. I really don't think, I think Heidegger would love this work. I suspect. And as I said, it surrenders nothing in terms of mathematics and technology. This is a highly technical work and generated by technical means, but it is not what Heidegger calls technique, which involves that commandeering, commanding relation to, or dominating relation to the, to what is brought into the frame, as you put it, the Stell or the Gestell. So that was my attempt here, was to try to think, okay, can we think about a relation to techniques, technique, which nevertheless preserves an ethos and the possibility of dwelling. And then so I was trying to understand how we might think those two sides of the question concerning technology.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are at our end time. Gabriel, should we?
I think we can maybe start wrapping. Just a reminder to everyone as well, this the event is being recorded and will be available in the YouTube channel, the EGS YouTube channel soon. So you can also check things there again. Thank you very much, Chris.
I want to thank everybody who has participated, also those who have come to join us. I'm sorry that time has not allowed us to be more free in discussion and exchange. I hope that will come in further email exchanges and so forth. We're having to fit this into a very tight schedule, and so my apologies. But for me, it's been extremely rich, and I'm very, very grateful to Ben, Nicholas, Shin, and also Ellie, who put forward that presentation, which will also be accompanying the other recordings that we have. So my sincere thanks, and well, stay safe, and all of you, and so I'll see some of you tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for organizing this and for keeping, and also just a last word, thank you for keeping all of this seminar and this curriculum together under extremely difficult circumstances. We're all in your debt for that. So thank you.
Let me, by the way, I've been meaning all along to thank Nemanja Mitrovic, who is sitting in the background and who's done an awful lot of the organizing with regard to particularly the technical side of this. He's been absolutely essential. So thanks to Nemanja, and again, also thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.